Hi class, and welcome to Module 7 Video 1 for Music Appreciation Online, the 20th Century and Jazz. After completing this module, students will correctly define terms related to the 20th century: Impressionism, Expressionism, atonality, minimalism, whole tone scale, polytonality, 12-tone system, Musik concrete, Sprechstimme, serialism, tone cluster, polychord, tone row, and polyrhythm. After completing this section, students will correctly define terms related to jazz: call and response, blue note, ragtime, bebop, scat singing, break, chorus, New Orleans style, riff, combo, improvisation, frontline, blues, swing, tag, cool style, jazz rock fusion, modal jazz, and head. After completing this module, students will correctly name significant composers of 20th century and jazz and list their contributions: Debussy, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Bartok, Ives, Gershwin, Still, Copland, Ginastera, Cage, Varese, Zwilich, Scott Joplin, Bessie Smith, Fletcher Henderson, Buddy Bolden, Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Miles Davis. After completing this section, students will correctly identify from oral examples the music of all of the different style periods. See final exam test review for the listening list. As we begin our discussion of the 20th century, I think it is interesting to note that most of you who are taking this course were born in the 20th century, so it's not that long ago. Still, so much has changed in the past 100 years or so. Although the 20th century gave us incredible advances in technology, it was a time period of strife, 2 world wars and other wars, dictators, massive global economic depression, and world famine. It is remarkable to think that we can produce more food than ever, but there are still millions of hungry people. Even with more economic opportunity, there is still massive poverty. And did you know that there are currently about 40 armed conflicts, wars, in other words, going on around the world? On a happier note, many wonderful things have been invented over the past 100 years. Here is a link to a historical timeline of different inventions of the 20th century, the inventors and the inventions. Technology has profoundly affected art and music. 100 years ago, there were no viable recordings. Edison had really just begun the process. If you wanted to hear music, it had to be a live performance. Today, of course, we can carry thousands of tunes with us on our iPods or smartphones. Trust me though, live performance is better. You can see and feel the music as well as hear it. During the 20th century, cultural diversity began to be more accepted. Artists and musicians were influenced by various cultures as pluralism began to take shape. Whereas Europe dominated the cultural landscape of the 19th century, the United States became the main center of cultural activity for the 20th century. Cities such as New York and Los Angeles helped to shape popular culture, not just in the U.S., but abroad. During the 20th century, many of the trends established by the end of the 19th century were carried over into the new era. The experimental attitude of artists and musicians became known as avant-garde. It is a French term that means advance guard and refers to a military concept. In the arts, the term avant-garde became known as a style that was ahead of its time. Composers looked for new means of expression, even to the point of changing many of the parameters of more traditional music. Each composer developed a personal musical language. New methods for organizing pitch, rhythm, and harmony profoundly changed the way music is perceived. Composers were influenced by a wide range of European and non-Western cultures such as Africa and Asia. Even hints of early American jazz found its way into modern classical works. We have traced musical elements throughout our look at various style periods, and there were many profound changes during the 20th century. Composers continued to expand the size and dynamic range of the orchestra by adding to most every section. Brass and woodwind players were expected to play a much wider range of notes and use some unusual techniques. Piano became a regular addition to the orchestral sound, not just as a solo instrument. And composers experimented with unusual combinations of instruments, especially with chamber groups. First, we'll look at harmony. Composers began experimenting with chord extensions, creating 5, 6, and 7-note chords, and completely new kinds of harmonies were developed, including polychords. 2 or more triads sound together. As an example, here is a polychord with a D major triad superimposed on top of a C major triad. It's a very colorful sound. Another new idea was to create chords built on intervals other than the third. One popular sonority was a chord built on fourths. It sounds like this. Again, it provides a different, more colorful sound. Jazz musicians have adopted these types of sounds in more modern styles of jazz. Finally, there is the tone cluster, which is defined as a chord made up of only whole steps and half steps. We expect these chords to be dissonant. Here is an example. Along with new harmonic possibilities, there was a new approach to tonality. For several hundred years, music had been based on the principle that there was a central tone or tonic that the music was based around. Even when pieces modulated, they would often return to the home key. During the 20th century, composers experimented with tonality. Influenced by the work of Richard Wagner, who often clouded tonality in his works, composers started using other approaches. Some composers used polytonality or bitonality, which is a technique of combining keys. Of course, polytonality could be more than 2 keys. Bitonality was most common, combining 2 keys together. For instance, we might hear a melody in one key and the accompaniment in a different key. Here is an example using a familiar tune. Eventually, some composers abandoned tonality altogether. We use the term atonality to describe an absence of tonal reference. There is no key. Our ears are never able to really find home base. Here is an example. To be sure, some composers experimented with a variety of sounds. Many composers even used a blend of tonality and atonality. With regard to rhythm, composers experimented with new techniques emphasizing irregularity and creating a less predictable musical flow. Occasionally, composers would combine 2 or more specific rhythmic patterns together, creating polyrhythms. Other composers wrote pieces with odd meters, like 7/4 or 5/8, or creating mixed meter, where the meter changes frequently and often quickly. Trust me, you can't dance or tap your foot to most of these works. Then there are pieces that feature polymeter, 2 or more meters occurring simultaneously. This makes the music very complex and difficult to perform. And of course, 20th century classical music was influenced by early jazz. Later composers also used rhythmic patterns and styles from various other cultures. Melody during the 20th century began to take on a different contours. Many melodies sounded awkward and featured wide melodic skips and very chromatic intervals. Often the phrase lengths were irregular, and some of these tunes were definitely not easy to hum or whistle. Here's a short example. To be certain, not all 20th century melodies were atonal or disjunct, but many were asymmetrical and somewhat angular. The first composer we'll discuss is the Frenchman, Claude Debussy. Much like Beethoven 100 years earlier, Debussy was a transitional figure. His career began at the end of the 19th century, but his music was very progressive. He became the first musical impressionist. We'll discuss that more shortly. Early in his career, Debussy was influenced by Richard Wagner, but Wagner's music was too heavy and pompous for the light-hearted Frenchman. Debussy broke new ground by using chords with 5 or 6 different pitches. His melodies were based on unusual scales, such as pentatonic and whole tone. First, let's hear an example of the pentatonic scale. As you can hear, it has kind of an exotic sound. This scale has been around for a long time and has been used by many different cultures from Eastern and Asian to Native American. Next, let's hear a whole tone scale. It has a mysterious sound, in part because there are no half steps. Our ears can't determine a beginning or end. This is considered a symmetrical scale because all of the intervals are exactly the same. Now let's get back to Impressionism. It is the first of several isms we talk about, and like most styles, this one began as a style of visual art. In the 1870s in Paris, France, there was a group of young artists who wanted to create a new painting style. They sat around in the cafes of the Montmartre section of Paris, drinking espresso and smoking. They also discussed a new method of applying paint to the canvas. Artists like Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, Cézanne, Gauguin, and others started using small patches of paint as opposed to the traditional broad brushstrokes. When you look at one of these paintings up close, it looks like a series of small blotches of paint. But when you back up and allow your eyes to take in the whole painting, then an image starts to emerge. These painters also explored light and shadows, and they used more pastel colors in their work. These young painters were too progressive for the Paris establishment, and they often had to produce exhibits of their own work. One such exhibit featured the work pictured here by Claude Monet. It is thought to have inspired the name of this movement, as the title implies. An art critic used the term in a derisive manner in an article about the exhibit. The name persisted, and these young painters embraced the name. The artwork of the Impressionists influenced the next generation of painters. Now, how does all this relate to musical Impressionism? Claude Debussy was among the many artistic friends counted by these painters. So he began to think of ways to create this kind of style musically. He created a new style based on atmosphere, tone color, and fluidity, and characterized by an emphasis of woodwind tone colors and the unusual chords and scales mentioned earlier. Debussy chose chords based on the sound of the harmony more than the function, and his music seems to wander from key to key very fluidly. There were also writers and poets who adopted this concept. They were known as the symbolist poets and chose words as much for the sound as for the meaning. Of course, the words had to make sense in context, but the sound and inflection were important. Here is a poem by French symbolist poet Stéphane Mallarmé called The Faun. It is a story about a mythological creature, half man, half goat, that is reminiscing about his affair with several woodland nymphs. He goes in and out of a dreamlike state and even plays a solo on his pan flute. This is not the entire poem, but it gives you a sense of how the poet chose words, even translated into English. Debussy took this poem and created a symphonic poem based on the work by Mallarmé. It gives us some imagery of the poem and certainly implies the dreamlike quality of the poem. To hear The Afternoon of a Faun by Claude Debussy, log in to the Connect website. Our next composer is the great Russian artist Igor Stravinsky. We've already discussed him as a part of Module 1, but we will now focus on why he was such an important figure. Stravinsky was one of the most influential and provocative composers of the entire 20th century. His innovations in rhythm, tone color, and harmony established a new way of thinking about these musical elements. His career spanned a majority of the 20th century, and his personal sound was subject to several style categories that developed during his lifetime. In his earlier works, Stravinsky wrote in a style that is now known as primitivism, a style that was intended to conjure the imagery of primitive culture. In the middle part of his career, he began writing works that are now considered neoclassical, a style that intended to reflect the sound and forms of the 18th century music. Later in his career, Stravinsky experimented with the 12-tone system established by Schoenberg, the next composer we'll cover. Stravinsky may be best known for his works written for the Russian ballet. The ballet was brought to Paris due to political unrest fomented by the Russian Revolution. Impresario Sergei Diaghilev sought to create a ballet company that broke new ground. He hired young artists like Pablo Picasso to paint sets, and a young composer named Igor Stravinsky to write music. Diaghilev had heard some of Stravinsky's early works and thought he would provide the perfect musical backdrop for his avant-garde staged works. Stravinsky essentially wrote 3 scores for the Ballet Russe, as it was known: The Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. The Rite of Spring was a monumental work that Stravinsky began cultivating in 1910. It was intended to evoke primitive Russian culture, and because of the insistent rhythms and heavy use of percussion, it now falls under the category of primitivism. Diaghilev insisted that Stravinsky use a large orchestra with expanded woodwind, brass, and percussion sections. Considering the size of most orchestra pits, this was a challenging request. You can see from the instruments listed this was a major undertaking. Stravinsky used unusual combinations of instruments and made technical demands on the players not common before the 20th century. Stravinsky borrowed heavily from Russian folk music. He used multiple layers of sound and created dense polyrhythms. Stravinsky changed meter frequently and shifted accents to weak beats, so that this is very disconcerting to try and tap your foot. Remember, this was a ballet and people were dancing difficult choreography to this music. Stravinsky apparently got the idea for this piece as he was working on his first ballet, The Firebird, in 1910. He suggested a story about a pagan ritual whereby wise elders choose a young girl who will be sacrificed in order to stimulate the beginnings of spring. At the very end of the work, the girl dances until she dies of exhaustion. The ballet is in 2 main parts. Part 1 features an introduction where the woodwinds are featured. It conjures imagery of the earth beginning to come to life after a long, hard winter, typical in Russia. Part 1 continues with various rituals as they begin the process of choosing their sacrificial dancer. Part 2 features more ritual, then at the end we hear the sacrificial dance. Stravinsky used the percussion and brass to really create a sense of tension and anticipation. He created some unusual harmonies to add to the sense of foreboding, including a very dense polychord that occurs in the second tableau or scene of the ballet. He superimposes an E-flat 7th chord over an E major triad voiced in the low register of the string section. The chord is repeated in 8th notes with startling accents. Be sure to listen for this when you hear this example on the Connect site. One of the most revolutionary composers during the 20th century was Arnold Schoenberg, the Viennese expressionist. Like the other isms, expressionism affected visual art and music. Expressionism is a style characterized by intense subjective emotion. Artists and composers intended to shock their audience. Distorted imagery and dramatic use of color were features of expressionist painters. Schoenberg, who was a good amateur expressionist painter, found ways to do this in music. Schoenberg did not necessarily try to shock his audience, but he was motivated by the need for new, more abstract form of musical expression. He composed primarily atonal music, that is, music with no reference to any key or scale. Like Stravinsky, Schoenberg basically developed not only a personal style, but a personal musical language. Although his early works bridged the gap between late Romantic and early 20th century, Schoenberg was clearly motivated by his quest to organize a system for composing atonal music. In the early 1920s, Schoenberg finally developed his system for composing with 12 tones, sometimes also called the 12-tone method. This system influenced countless other composers during the 20th century and is still being used today. Any music student who studies music theory or composition has to learn to compose with Schoenberg's system in order to understand how it works. Before we get to the music, you should have a look at this famous example of an expressionist painting. It was painted by Norwegian painter Edvard Munch and is called The Scream. The distorted imagery and use of bold colors demonstrates the shock value of the style. In addition, authors, painters, and composers were interested in the human psyche and all of the implications of the darker part of human psychology. The famous psychologist Sigmund Freud was doing some of his best-known work during the early 20th century. As with much famous artwork, this piece has appeared in American popular culture and has been used in advertising. Maybe you have seen this before. Our first example by Schoenberg was written in 1913, just after Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Schoenberg had not yet codified his system, so this piece is considered freely atonal. It is called Pierrot Lunaire and is based on a set of poems by Belgian poet Albert Giraud. There are 21 poems in the set, all revolving around Pierrot, the puppet clown. Pierrot was a well-known character in Commedia dell'arte and was often used by artists to represent the disenfranchised modern artist. In this set of poems, Pierrot has a relationship with the moon. In other words, he confides in the moon, talks to the moon, and becomes intoxicated from moonlight. So this is quite abstract and requires the listener to be open-minded. Schoenberg even invented a new vocal technique that he felt would best express the emotions he was trying to portray. He called this Sprechstimme, or speech voice in English. It is halfway between speaking and singing. The singer basically sings a pitch and then falls off the pitch, sort of like a trombone glissando. Pierrot Lunaire is basically a set of art songs, except the piano is not the only accompaniment. 4 other instrumentalists are featured. 3 of them double on 2 instruments, although they only play one at a time. Flute and piccolo, clarinet and bass clarinet, violin and viola, and cello. This allowed Schoenberg to create interesting blends of timbre to support the voice. Our example is the very first song from the set called Mondesdrunken, or Moon Drunk in English. Listen at the Connect website. Now let's talk about Schoenberg's method of composing with 12 tones. This system is designed to provide some sense of organization to atonal music, which often does not sound organized. Just like the tonal system, there are rules that the composer must follow. The first step is to create a tone row. This is simply putting the 12 pitches in some order, left to right, one after the other. The idea is that notes within the row are not supposed to be repeated until all 12 notes are sounded. Of course, Schoenberg did allow for some repetition, but very limited. There are over 4 million possible combinations of the 12 tones, so it is unlikely a single composer will exhaust the possibilities. The tone row is also referred to as a set or series, so we also refer to 12-tone music as serial music. To offer variety within a composition, Schoenberg designed several other permutations of the row that could be used. Beside the original row, there is retrograde, where the row is stated backwards. There is inversion, where the row is turned upside down, but all of the intervals have to remain the same. For instance, if the first 2 notes create the interval of an ascending fourth, then the inversion would have to also be a descending fourth. This is similar to what we discussed in the Baroque era with the fugue. Finally, a composer can use retrograde inversion, which is backwards and upside down at the same time. So there are automatically 48 different rows generated from the original order. Typically, the composer will use several of these, often in different combinations, to create various textures. After Schoenberg developed this system, other composers began applying this concept to rhythm, dynamics, and tone color, sometimes creating a completely serialized work. Our second example by Schoenberg was composed in 1945 after he had moved to the United States. This piece, A Survivor from Warsaw, features a tone row that is indicated at the top of this 12-tone matrix. The matrix was designed to show all of the different versions of the row. Each row, original, retrograde, inversion, and retrograde inversion, can all be transposed to begin on any of the 12 pitches. This is how we come up with the 48 different rows. This is the matrix generated by the original row for A Survivor from Warsaw. You can see down the left-hand side, all of the original rows related to the original order are labeled P for prime. Across the top are all of the rows related to the inversion. Across the bottom are all of the rows related to the retrograde inversion. And along the right-hand side are all of the rows related to retrograde. This page is from your textbook and shows some of the notation for this piece. I have labeled the notes of the rows 1 through 12 to show their position in the row. This section of the piece comes toward the end, where there is a dramatic climax with a male chorus singing this prayer in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael. This section begins with the prime row untransposed, Then on the third staff system down, the E flat on the syllables ELO end the first row, but simultaneously begin the inverted form transposed up 5 semitones, or half steps. So it's labeled I5. This should not be confused with the interstate by the same name. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Before you listen to a survivor from Warsaw, a little more background is warranted. Schoenberg, who was Jewish, clearly was moved by the story of a Polish Jew who had survived the Nazi concentration camps in Warsaw, Poland during World War II. This work could be thought of as a modern-day cantata, but very different to those by Bach years earlier. This piece is based on a true story of this man who survived the Nazis. Schoenberg used 3 languages to portray this event: English, his adopted language after he immigrated to the U.S., German, the language of the Nazi soldiers, and finally Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people. The narrator uses Sprechstimme, which makes this piece even more dramatic. It's safe to say that the murder of 6 million people was one of the most horrific incidents in human history. The pleasant-sounding tonal music of earlier generations could not express the emotions of this work. Only Schoenberg's atonality fits. Now listen at the Connect site. Our last composer of this video is the Hungarian master Bela Bartok. Like the composers discussed so far, Bartok created his own musical language out of a combination of tonal and atonal elements. Bartok and his fellow Hungarian composer Zoltán Kodály researched the folk music of not only Hungary, but most of the surrounding Slavic territories such as Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and others. They took an early version of a Thomas Edison phonograph recording device and literally went into the fields to record peasants singing folk songs. Bartok and Kodály became experts in folk music and could be considered among the earliest ethnomusicologists. Bartok's music shows a strong influence of his work with the folk music, but it is also infused with a personal style characterized by rhythmic variety, unusual harmony like the tone cluster, and often very polyphonic texture. He tended to work within the traditional forms, but clearly put his personality into these works. Our example is from a well-known piece by Bartok called Concerto for Orchestra. It was commissioned by the Boston Symphony in 1943. Bartok, like Stravinsky and Schoenberg, immigrated to the U.S. to avoid the political unrest in Europe. After having settled in New York, Bartok suffered an illness that left him bedridden. In an effort to help Bartok, several musicians and members of ASCAP decided to try to raise money for Bartok. Through connections to the conductor of the Boston Symphony, these folks were able to secure a commission for Bartok. The piece he wrote was the Concerto for Orchestra. Bartok's concept was to feature the entire orchestra as a solo instrument. It is a 5-movement work, so unusual for a concerto. We will hear Movement 2, which is subtitled A Game of Pairs. In this movement, Bartok features 5 pairs of wind instruments, each playing its own unique melody. What is unusual is that each pair is separated by a different melodic interval, but playing parallel. This is sort of like the organum discussed in the Middle Ages. After a brief introduction played by a snare drum with the snares turned off, we hear 2 bassoons, then 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 flutes, and lastly 2 muted trumpets. The middle section of this movement sounds almost like a hymn, and it features the brass with some very pretty harmony. The movement ends with a slightly varied return to the A section, and it ends also with the snare drum again. Listen to this unusual and catchy piece at the Connect site.